On behalf of His All Holiness, Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew, I'd like to welcome everyone to the second evening and second webinar of our Halki Summit. While politics and science, and by analogy, religion and science, do not always meet eye to eye, or even mix very well, the pandemic has compelled them to enter our relationship, even if with some regret or resistance. How have governments responded to scientists and the science of COVID-19 and climate change? How have churches responded to scientists and to the science of COVID-19 and climate change? Does a vaccine solve all our problems? Are we prepared to make necessary changes in our lives? How has COVID-19 affected science and technology, as well as our perception of science and religion? Climate and COVID are shared crises, global challenges, so our response needs to be shared as well. Both climate and COVID provide an opportunity to reflect on and recall who and what matters most to us, to remember and realize what our priorities are, to recognize our vocation and responsibility to protect our neighbor and our environment, the most marginalized and most vulnerable. Ultimately, climate and COVID compel us to ask ourselves, can we imagine a different world with more equality, less pollution? Can we imagine a different way where we care for others and not just ourselves? Or will we return to past patterns and habits, to what we considered normal, but also led us to the conditions we now face? His Eminence Metropolitan John of Pergamon taught at the universities of Edinburgh and Glasgow, as well as London and Thessaloniki. He chaired the Ecumenical Patriarchate's Religion, Science and Environment Committee, and currently chairs our Halki Summits. Along with His All Holiness, he has personally attended every seminar, every symposium, every summit of the Ecumenical Patriarchate. His environmental addresses will be published later this year by T&T Clark. His Eminence was gracious enough to prepare a reflection for this Halki Summit, and I am honored to present it to you this evening.
I should like to begin by expressing my warmest thanks and congratulations to the organizer of this new Halki Summit, particularly Father John Chrysafis and his collaborators, who, with the blessing of His All Holiness Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew, continue and keep alive the long tradition of the Ecumenical Patriarchate's initiatives for the protection of our only and irreplaceable home, God's creation. The circumstances in which the world community finds itself today, with the COVID-19 pandemic, are teaching us many lessons. And there is a wide discussion going on about the causes and the effects of this situation. Allow me to concentrate on the following points. 1. The present pandemic is not unrelated to the ecological crisis. It has been pointed out by specialists on ecology that the destruction of forests for the purpose of cultivating land in order to increase food production has released viruses from their natural environment and brought them into contact with the human organism, which is now striving to cope with them. We are thus warned that epidemics or pandemics of this kind are to be expected even in the near future, as long as the present way of agriculture and food production continues. We are learning, therefore, unfortunately, not theoretically, but by very costly experience, that our unlimited exploitation of nature for the sake of economic growth can have catastrophic consequences for humanity itself. The elevation of economic growth to the highest ideal in our modern societies is upsetting the peaceful coexistence of the various natural species, a coexistence built by millions of years of natural evolution. And we are thus reminded that, alas, with a heavy cost, that we are not masters and proprietors of nature, but called by God to protect and cultivate it by respecting its laws and its integrity and honoring its creator. The second point from the pandemic, which you are called to listen to, has to do with the limits of science. It is not only economics, but also natural science and medical sciences that are to a great extent responsible for the disturbance of humanity's relationship with nature. I'm not referring to widespread and unproved rumors that the coronavirus was the result of laboratory experiments. What I have in mind is the biotechnical interventions into nature, verging on the boundaries of species and threatening their variety and their right to existence. Science is often giving the impression that it operates as if the rest of nature existed simply in order to serve the needs of humanity. The present pandemic teaches us that even a small and almost invisible natural element can challenge this assumption. The rights and power of science have their limits. It is at this point, I think, that probably the most difficult lesson from the pandemic emerges. Scientists are heard to be saying today that the coronavirus will certainly be defeated because science possesses the means to do that. The vaccine is presented as the solution to the problem. But what about after the vaccine? If we continue treating nature in the way we do, humanity will be called again to pay the same high toll of millions of deaths and new economic crises. It is only, and science by itself will not be able to prevent this from happening. It is only our healthy relationship with nature that may help us to avoid it. And this will require an ethos stemming from the faith that nature is not our property. Religion cannot become redundant without a heavy cost for all of us. The third point that emerges as a lesson of the pandemic is addressed now to religion. The pandemic did not reveal tendencies of self-sufficiency only in science. It has brought out also a tendency of religion to disregard science, and this constitutes an equally serious problem. We have been observing the phenomenon of a great number of religious believers who doubt and disregard scientific data and advice. refusing to wear masks and be vaccinated, while theories of conspiracy against religion are spreading and thriving all over the world. Where does this anti-science hysteria costing human lives come from? This is a broader issue which sociologists and historians of culture will have to investigate. As far as religion is concerned, the pandemic has brought to the surface a long-standing need for dialogue between religion and science, which would help each side to appreciate the other's role and significance. An attempt at such a dialogue was initiated by the Ecumenical Patriarchate in connection with the ecological problem some years ago, with a series of symposia which promised to bear fruit. The current pandemic is teaching us that religion must respect scientific findings and advice, and science must learn that truth and life cannot be imprisoned or exhausted in the scientific laboratory. Dear friends, the human being does not always learn from crisis, and the tendency is usually to return to old habits as soon as the crisis is over. But it is hoped that we shall learn from the present pandemic is, among other things, that the dilemma economy versus health, or economy or health, which seems to preoccupy and torment politicians all over the world today, not knowing to which of the two sides they should give priority, relates to the fact that economic growth has been so absolutized in our culture that people are unwilling and unprepared to lower their living standards, even when their health is at stake, let alone the survival of our natural environment. In fact, our health is now dependent on our economic standards. Thus, as soon as the expected messiah of the vaccine arrives, and we are certainly grateful to science for that, we shall hurry back to our old habits, maximizing our economic prosperity at the expense of nature and perhaps of our own health. And then, whenever a new epidemic, when a new epidemic arrives, we shall be looking again for the arrival of a new vaccine to save us, making science into religion, humanity's only hope. This appears to be a predetermined course for the future, unless the current crisis teaches us the lesson of tempering our greed and egocentrism, which lie at the roots of our problems. Unless we learn to cherish more other values in our life, which the pandemic has taken away from us, such as personal contact and communion, loving relationships that count more than material goods, and a natural environment that we can share with others and bequeath to our children. May the present pandemic prove to be a blessing in disguise, a teacher of the lessons we need to learn most. Thank you.
I think that His Eminence has set the tone here for our webinar this evening. but let me introduce our three distinguished guests. Katharine Hayhoe is an atmospheric scientist who studies climate change and why it matters. She has received the American Geophysical Union's Climate Communication Prize, the Stephen Schneider Climate Communication Award, and the United Nations Champion of the Earth Award. She is the Political Science Endowed Professor in Public Policy and Public Law and co-directs the Climate Center at Texas Tech University.
Thank you. It's great to be here with you today.
Good to have you. Nadia Abuelezam is an epidemiologist and professor at the Ecumenical School of Nursing at Boston College. Trained at the Harvard Chan School of Public Health in mathematical modeling, data analytic approaches in public health, and mitigating health inequities for vulnerable populations, Dr. Abuelezam also serves with her husband, Father Vincent Minucci, at St. Demetrius Greek Orthodox Church in Weston, Massachusetts. Welcome, Nadia.
Thank you for having me.
And Gayle Woloschak, Professor of Radiation Oncology and Associate Dean of the Graduate School at Northwestern University. Her scientific interests are predominantly in the areas of molecular biology studies, where she has authored over 250 scientific papers. Dr. Woloschak also holds a D.Min from Pittsburgh Theological Seminary, and her theological work has focused on bioethical issues, including climate change. Welcome to all of you.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Katharine, let me open with you.
Do you want to listen to Katharine Hayhoe?
Yes?
Do you want to listen to her?
I think we've got someone on Spiridula.
Go ahead.
Okay. So let me open with you. Of course, today there were several things that happened in the administration here in the United States. But one of your many memorable tweets, one of my favorites, is your list of the 6 stages of climate denial. They are, it's not real, it's not us, it's not that bad, it's too expensive to fix. Here's a great solution that actually does nothing. And finally, oh no, now it's too late. You should have warned us earlier. The unfortunate reality is that in our time, religion has become just as politicized as science. So Katharine, what similarities do you see between COVID and climate change?
I see many similarities, and because we're speaking of our faith, I can state very clearly that they boil down to having false gods. We have set up our political identity and our culture as the objects that we worship. And when they come in conflict with the Bible or with what we believe, we will go with our politics over common sense, over science, and over what our theology tells us. We have already seen this manifest in climate change, where faith leaders around the world, Pope Francis, Patriarch Bartholomew, the World Evangelical Alliance, even the US National Association of Evangelicals, all understand and publicly acknowledge the urgency of climate action. Yet when you ask people in the United States, do you think climate change is real and serious? At the very bottom of the pile, you have white Catholics, and right next to them, you have white evangelicals saying, no, this is not a problem and it's not real.
I think you have a lot of Orthodox there as well. And at least in this country, most of them are white. But Gayle, if this is exactly, of course, what Metropolitan John was talking about, this notion of worshipping the economy or worshipping science, but the idols that Katharine's talking about. So if we're talking about this making connections, this interconnectedness, Gayle, how exactly do environmental problems disrupt the unity of creation? How does abuse of the environment spoil right relationships among humans and of humans with other species?
So let me talk about an old example, and let me talk that's still alive today, and then I can bring it to COVID as well. But so, there were studies that were done following insect numbers. I mean, I'm a scientist. I'm going to think like a scientist. They follow insect numbers. And one of the things that's dropping the most are honeybees, particularly in Europe right now, but even in the US. What pollinates most of our crops are honeybees. The problem has gotten, and what they showed in the UK was that the honeybees have been replaced by another insect, a fly, which is not capable of pollinating. So what's happening is insects are moving in to replace the missing honeybees, but they're not able to do the same jobs. So climate change has forced honeybees into new places than they were before, has created new infections for them, which is making them die out. And in fact, in China, it's so bad that now there are people that are hand pollinating apple trees in order to keep apples alive. So there are not, they used to actually rent out honeybees to use them to pollinate their crop. They can't even do that because the honeybees are so expensive to rent out because they're so they're so few. So this is one change that's impacting us tremendously. And what's going to happen is we're going to be stuck using crops that are mostly pollinated by wind, which is going to be like wheat, a lot of the boring, like corn, the boring foods that we don't like so much. And the things like the cool fruits and things like that, we're going to lose them because of our inability to pollinate. So that's a problem that is directly related to environment that impacts us. Now just think for a minute about the impact on the honeybees and what other things honeybees might impact and what other things not having apples might impact. So we think about it in human terms, but in this sort of broad creation terms, just getting rid of honeybees alone may have significant consequences for creation. And these are things we're doing because, as Katharine said, we're putting it off. We're saying it's not a problem. It costs too much. So that's sort of an old problem. I could talk about the COVID problem, but maybe I should stop because I tend to talk too much.
Well, tell me how you think the pandemic has influenced the way we think about it.
So I will. So now let me take the new problem, which Metropolitan John really did a good job of introducing, but I'm going to take it to a different level than he did because I'm going to put in a little bit of science there. So most of the current thinking is that the COVID virus came from bats in China. So bats were somehow introduced into this population, whether it was through food or from close contact or whatever. And the bat passed the virus on eventually to the human population. In 2007, there was a paper in one of the infectious diseases journals that said, watch out for these viruses, these coronaviruses. They're going to spread from wild animals to humans because as we are invading the space where these animals are, we're coming into more contact with them. And as we see them, people eat them, actually. There's like one theory is that it's a bat soup that people made that passed it. Another was that it was just selling bats in the marketplace. But because of that destruction of the wild places where bats live, they too are moving into new environments like the honeybees are. And we are seeing them a lot more because they're moving into our environment. And there's this movement from wildlife to humans. We used to get most of our viral infections from domestic animals. Now they're coming from wild animals. So it's our direct effect on the environment that's causing this.
I'm guessing that bat soup is something we can at least give up during Lent.
I would think so because it's a meat, right?
So Nadia, let's take it now to the pandemic itself. What's the scientific relationship between the climate change crisis and the infectious disease pandemics? And how might continued climate change impact future disease pandemics?
Sure. I mean, we've seen even in the last few years an increase in the number of emerging infections. If you just think about emerging infections like SARS or MERS or Ebola, those have all happened in very recent history. And scientists are attributing this actually to the results of climate change. And there are a number of ways in which climate change can impact the emergence of these infectious diseases. First, we could actually see that these organisms are evolving over time. We could also see that these organisms or infections are actually able to spread to new locations or populations. This is largely due to our globalization and our increase in air travel and other types of travel. But then we also see that when certain environments are going ecological transformations, we see an increase in the number of unrecognized infections that pop up in human populations. And we also know that there's a chance for old infections to reemerge due to things like antimicrobial resistance or a breakdown in public health. So we're actually seeing the impact of climate change on a number of different aspects of global diseases. First, we're seeing an increase in host susceptibility, meaning human susceptibility to infectious diseases. That has a lot to do with the ways in which we've changed our use of technology. We've been exposed to a number of different harmful and toxic industries that have increased our susceptibility to these organisms. We've also seen, as I've said, an emergence of new diseases, and this is largely due to a breakdown of traditional ecological systems due to deforestation and other types of movements. And then we've also seen an increase in disease transmission. So again, due to increased air travel, globalization, there's a large amount of transmission that's going on and a large amount of change happening to the microbial environment. And as was just mentioned, all of these ecologies, right, are actually interconnected. So our human ecology is very connected to the microbial ecology, and we're seeing that now as a result of COVID directly.
So before I move on to next set of questions about the relationship between science and religion, which I think is very important, and I'd love to hear your views about. One question that has come in is, we've heard this evening that, you know, this began with animals and bats and so forth, but we keep hearing, this anonymous questioner says, we keep hearing that it's from a lab in China. And doctors go missing in China if they talk about this. Can you prove, is there any proof that it did not come from a lab? What would you say?
Sure. I mean, you know, I'm a molecular biologist. I actually create, we do a lot of cloning and sequencing and things like that that would be related to the creation of a virus in a lab. And there are certain markers that exist that you have to when you're doing a lab creation that doesn't happen naturally. We can't help it, it's the way it goes. We would see that in the sequence of the genome of the virus. I've looked for those things, they are not there. And many people have reported the same thing. So the markings that we would have for a lab virus are not present at all. We might find that in like the vaccine that's coming out of China, for instance, which is an adenovirus vaccine, and that's being created to some extent. So it has been genetically engineered, and it will probably have the markings of being genetically engineered, but that does not exist in the infected virus that we all receive.
Katharine, anything to add there?
I would add that it's emotionally comfortable to have somebody else to blame. So if we think somebody else did this, we can all point our finger at them. But if it was just our human disregard for this creation that God gifted to us and told us in the very beginning of the Bible that we were responsible to care for, and we failed in that responsibility, then we feel that culpability. And sadly, as humans, when we feel responsible for something, often our first defense is to deny. And the best way to deny is to point the finger at somebody or something else, which is why with climate change, we hear it's just a natural cycle, or it's the sun, or it's volcanoes, or it's a secret military experiment. We hear all of these finger pointing excuses because we don't want to admit that every single one of us is culpable to a certain extent. Yeah. But that's why we believe in God, because God grants us grace and forgiveness. So rather than using denial as a cover for our guilt, that is an opportunity for us to turn to God.
Spoken like a theologian. So let me now turn to this notion of science and religion and stay with you here, Katharine. The other day you recommended a book to me by Linda Walsh entitled Scientists as Prophets, and I looked it up. I looked her up as well. She teaches at the University of Nevada, and her previous book was entitled Sins Against Science, Scientific Media Hoaxes. Tell us something about how our disregard for science reflects our disregard for the planet, and what are the impacts of this denial or resistance?
What is science other than trying to understand how this universe works, how this incredible planet that is our home works, how we get our food and our water, what maintains our health and what threatens our health? Science simply explains how the world works, and we disregard it at our peril. As scientists and as people of faith, both of us, whether we're one or the other or both, we believe in the concept of truth, that there is truth, that you could say, I don't believe in gravity, but you'll still, if you step off the cliff, you'll still go down. So in the same way, we can say, I don't believe in COVID, or I don't believe in masks, or I don't believe in climate change, or I don't believe in sea level rise, but the only ones who will be harmed by that is us. You're muted there.
Thank you. Gayle, let's push this a little further because I think it's very important. Would you talk about the different responses or reactions that people have to science, particularly in light of both climate change and COVID?
Yeah, I'm afraid you're gonna have to stop me because I could talk forever on this. But I guess there are two main points I want to make. The first is that there are people who are what I would call bundlers. So you know how you bundle like your internet service with your television, with your telephone. They bundle them together. It's cheaper. It's a better deal. You might not get the best internet service or the best phone, but you bundle them together. And I do think there are a lot of people that bundle ideas together. And so they say, hey, look, I am pro-life. I believe in prayer in the schools. And you know what? In that bundle, there's anti-environment. There's don't wear masks. So I'm going to buy that whole bundle. And the problem is that, we're persons. Our job is to actually use our discernment and to not use bundles when it comes to how we live our lives. We need to think through each one of those issues and decide each one separately. It might mean more work. It might mean more homework, but that's important. That's, I think, the way we need to do it. So that's sort of one category. The second category, or maybe the second issue, is I'm going to use an example, no names. So I get an email from this person, this woman who's emailing me, telling me that vaccines are dangerous for you. Vaccines cause autism. Vaccines do all these things. And with every email, she sends me another post from some website that says that. And finally, I sent her an email and I say, look, all of the scientific information is available on the web for any person to look at least for medical things. It's called PubMed. It's free. It's available to anybody. I just did a search and there are about 400,000 articles available on PubMed on vaccines. And some of them are available for you to read in language that's set up for a layperson, certainly not the majority, but some of them are. Why don't you skim through some of those, do your homework, and when you are done with that, come back and talk to me again. The thing is, I would never allow my students to get away with not doing their homework and bothering people. I believe that what happens is people read one article or two articles, or they live in a clique of people that have a certain idea, but they never do the hard work of finding out. So it's, again, a second example of not doing the homework. Those are the two things that I think are are critical there.
You're not respecting science. You're not respecting life. It's
Father
what
John,
you
can I add to the bundle idea too? Because I think a very important piece of the bundle idea that I just want to mention is hatred towards particular people. So I think with COVID, and anti-Asian sentiment came in very quickly as soon as COVID came in. And that's not something that's new to COVID. It's actually something that's quite common with many infectious diseases. When we think about things like Ebola and fear of African people, things like HIV and fear of gay people, this fear, this hatred of the other comes bundled along with these ideas about science. And I think that that's a really important point that's very historical and is replaying right now.
That's a good point. And yeah, it's what, Gayle, you said, the problem is we're persons. That means there's some more that we need to look for and not just cheap or simple answers. Let's stay on the point of vaccines. And Nadia, I want to turn to you. I read about a poll this morning that said that people's denial or dismissal of science is somehow sort of improving. The good news, they said, is that numbers are up, and now 50% of Americans want to be vaccinated. And I thought, so the bad news is, well, 50% of Americans want to be vaccinated. How does vaccine hesitancy relate to all of this? And how effective is scientific communication about these things in different parts of the world?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really worrisome number to me, as it probably is to a number of people, considering the number of people we need to have vaccinated to reach any sort of herd immunity. But I think this idea of vaccine hesitancy is directly related to our ability to communicate science properly. So this comes down to a lot of mixed messages that the public was receiving very early on in the COVID pandemic. And when there are mixed messages coming from leadership, coming from the scientific community, that opens the way. It creates a gap for a lot of these rumors and false pieces of information to fill that void. And I think as scientists, we're really responsible for stepping up to that science communication gap and making sure that our messaging is very consistent. And again, I don't think that this is something new with COVID. This is something that has happened before. If we think about the early days of the HIV epidemic, there was a lot of uncertainty about how HIV was actually spread. And there were rumors that you could get HIV by sitting on a toilet that had HIV on it. Well, the role of scientists in that situation was to step up and inform the public about what the true transmission routes were. And so I think it's really important that when we talk about the vaccine, we're using clear scientific facts that the public can understand. And we need to talk about the risks in proportion to their reality. And I think that this is really important because when we use social media, a lot of the rare events, a lot of the 1 in a million events get amplified on social media, proportionally not relevant to their actual risk. And so I think as scientists, we need to be careful about what we're spending our time focusing on and talking about, and making sure that we're amplifying the important information that people need to make decisions about getting vaccinated.
What would you say are the implications of what you've just communicated to us for climate science? Is there any difference between the two?
I definitely think that it's related. I think that, again, there are gaps in the public's knowledge related to climate change that have been filled by rumors, that have been filled by false facts. And it's the responsibility of scientists and science communicators to step up to the plate and fill that void. And I definitely think that this is true for a number of different issues related to science. And I think it's because science is scary to the general public. I think there is a sense that it's not something that's easy to understand. But I think with social media, we actually have an opportunity to expand the public's knowledge. In a way, using creative ways. And I know other people on this call have been doing that very successfully.
So you have been communicating very clearly, actually, all of you. I have a couple of questions here, or several actually, on this relationship between science and religion, and I wonder if any of you want to comment. I'll read two parts out here from two questions. The science-religion conflict that emerged in some circles within the COVID-19 pandemic illustrates both scientific and theological illiteracy, in which political orientations trumped both deep scientific and theological commitments. What can we do about that? And a second question related, what is it about conservative or fundamentalist Christianity that distrusts science so much? Any comments on that? I'll start with you, Katharine, maybe.
Yes. So I want to emphasize that this distrust of science is primarily an American phenomenon. It has spread to other countries. For example, I'm a climate scientist. I travel extensively and speak with Christians in other countries. And I have encountered climate denial in my home country of Canada, in the UK, Australia, other places. But every time it tracks back to the US. So it isn't something about Christian theology per se, because if it was, it would be, uniform across the world. It's something about American culture.
Right.
And this actually dates back very far back. You can actually track the roots of science denial back to the beginning of the American Revolution, when they cast off the Church of England, the Methodist Church, all of the foreign churches from England, and they had to form their own political and religious system, which quickly became enmeshed with each other. And by the early 1900s, the evolution debate was seen as a political issue against the socialism and godlessness that was arising at that time in the Soviet Union and to a certain extent in Germany. And so the famous Scopes trial, the person who was prosecuting the teacher who taught evolution, was the former Secretary of State. So in the US, politics and science denial have gone hand in hand for a very long time. And this was exactly what happened with Galileo. It wasn't religion, it was politics and science denial. But what happens is we put an icing of religiosity on the cake to hide what's underneath and make it seem palatable and even potentially spiritual sometimes.
That's a good point. Not so sure it's just American. I think it's polarized more here in America. I think it's you can feel it in every single aspect of culture in America. But Gayle, I wonder if I can turn to you, if you're comfortable answering a question about advice and spiritual counsel that often is given to people in the Orthodox Church by holy elders or even saints, recently canonized saints who've written about, not trusting science or not trusting the secular world, or the end of the world is coming, or no vaccines are good. How should people respond to that?
Well, first of all, people have to make up their own minds and be persons. But one point I try to make to a lot of people is that we don't always remember history. So the Orthodox Church was opposed to chemotherapy when it first came out. Why was it opposed to chemotherapy? Because we're poisoning people. How dare we poison people? And you know what? Chemotherapy does poison people. It poisons the cancer, but at the same time, the person gets poisoned too. And that's why a lot of times their hair falls out and they have all these other effects. And then we hope that they're going to get through that poisoning and survive it, but that the cancer will die. Well, that was in the very early days when chemo first came out. There were many Orthodox opinions against it, particularly monastic opinions against it. And now there are monks that are treated with chemo. I mean, I think a lot of times there's this immediate reaction to something that, if we're Orthodox, we have to be against it because it's not ancient enough for us, or it's not something we've always done before. Where instead, I think we need to weigh things on a much finer scale. We need to think very hard about what are the potential benefits? What are the potential things? I mean, nobody would say take a patient in stage 4 disease that has 2 days, apparently 2 days left to live, and give them yet another round of chemo. I mean, there's discernment that's needed for that. Well, I think in all these cases, there's discernment that's needed here, and it's just often not being seen that way. It's almost sometimes a one-size-fits-all.
So I think we'll come back to this in the discussion. There are lots of questions from our viewers, so I don't want to ignore them, but I think we've also touched on this subject. Let's direct the conversation in a different direction. And Katharine, I want you to talk about the conversion, the moral behavior that's needed here. Is there a relationship between the personal behavior change that's needed to end COVID-19 and the personal behavior change that's needed to address the climate crisis? And how are they related to one another? How are they related to principles of faith?
I think that rather than starting with behavior, I would start with the principles of faith, because science is like a compass. It can tell us which way is north or south or east or west. So science can tell us that the virus is real, that wearing a mask reduces our risk and keeps people safe, that the vaccine works. Science can tell us that climate is changing, that humans are responsible, and that the impacts are serious. But what do we do with that information? That's where our faith comes in, or our values. And for those of us who have faith, many of our values come from there. So our faith is like a map. It shows us where we want to go. And depending on what we believe and what we value, we could take the same set of facts and we could move in different directions with them. So what we do must be informed both by the facts that science provides, but also with our values. Do we care for the least of these? Do we care about the injustices that exist in this world that are being exacerbated by coronavirus and by climate change? Do we care about ourselves or the economy? What is it that we care about? And then how then should we act due to both our science and our faith? Bringing those together, I think, is the only way that we can act in a manner that's consistent with who we are and how the world actually works.
That's a good point. A follow-up question here about how much we're called to give up in order to do this. My son recently told me that COVID-19 provided us with a fascinating and invaluable social experiment. He said, throughout the pandemic, scientists and at least some, sadly not all, civil and religious authorities asked us to do the slightest, most trivial thing for the sake of others, for the sake of the planet. Wear a mask. And still the answer was no. Still the answer was politicized. Still the answer was about my rights or the First Amendment. What are the chances that people will respond to having less and hoarding less or wasting less and sharing more? What can you tell us about sacrifice?
Well, what I can say is this: the solution to climate change is not each of us as individuals doing with less. And actually, I have this right here. I have a couple of numbers here which kind of prove this point. So just follow me here. This is what we scientists do, a back of the envelope calculation. So about 54% of people in the US are alarmed or concerned about climate change. Now imagine that most of those people have the motivation, have the knowledge, and have the financial ability to take serious action to reduce their personal carbon footprint. Let's be very optimistic and say 50% of them can act. I didn't prepare this for tonight. I just had this sitting here. Really? Okay, so 50%, this is the way we scientists work. 50% of people are alarmed and concerned and have the ability to act. Very optimistic assumption, but we're being optimistic. Here's the problem. Only 30 to 40% of US emissions are actually the result of, and my camera's doing something funny. I have to go out and come back in again. There we go. 30 to 40% of US emissions are the result of personal choices. Just to give you an example, in West Texas, they flare as much natural gas, so they just waste it, as is currently used by almost every household in the entire state. So what is half of 40%? That is 20%. So now we're down to alarmed and concerned people being able to control 20% of US emissions. But even if you try as hard as you can, which I as a climate scientist have, it's hard to get below 50%. So if you divide 20 in half, you get 10%. That's a little unhappy face there.
That's very scientific. Yeah.
Yes. So all of our actions, I reduce my food waste. I eat more vegetables. I have a plug-in car. I have solar panels. I hang up my clothing to dry. I purchase carbon offsets. I do most of my presentations virtually. You know what though? To get to 100%, we can do that. How? We can do it by doing the one simple thing that everybody can do that is proven to make the biggest difference, and that is to use our voices to advocate for change at every level, to change, irrevocably change the social norms that make up the fabric of our society, as they were changed during the movement against slavery, as they were changed during suffragism, allowing women the vote, as they were changed during civil rights, as they were changed during the campaign against cigarettes and smoking, as they were changed during many cases in history. It is people using their voices to advocate for change, to talk about what they're doing, cutting food waste, not using plastic anymore, getting new technology, yes, but talking about it and inspiring that contagious social change is so important, because you know what? I don't have a sheet for this. I'll just have to give you the number. Only 1/3 of people in the United States ever hear anybody else talk about climate change, even occasionally. And if we don't talk about it, why would we care? And if we don't care, why would we ever do anything about it?
That's why what you're doing for us and with us this evening is so important, and I'm grateful. That's why the patriarch's words are sometimes, falling on deaf ears for 30 years. Matter nonetheless. At some point the penny will drop. Let me address the same question to you, Nadia, about personal behavior. What personal behavior changes do you think are needed to resolve the pandemic on the one hand and to address climate?
I think a lot of what's been mentioned in terms of doing your own research and make sure that it's scientific research to come to your own conclusions about what actions to take is really quite important. I think sharing that Facebook story or that Facebook post is easy to do, but if you don't do the actual research behind that story, you could actually be doing more harm than good in terms of perpetuating rumors and perpetuating false news. I also think that we have to be willing, as you've said, to make personal sacrifices in terms of our own movement, in terms of our own ability to go about our normal, what was pre-COVID lives. Wearing a mask is, I think, the least that we can do. But I think now in the era of available vaccinations, I think we also need to think about vaccination not only as a gift to ourselves, but as a gift to others as well. Because I think something that people don't think about often is there is a proportion of the population that cannot receive vaccinations because they have autoimmune diseases, because they might have particular cancers. So they literally cannot be vaccinated, and they rely on others to receive the vaccination to protect them. And so if we look at vaccination not only as a personal safety measure, but also as a way of improving our community, of helping others, I think that's one way to see vaccination as definitely a Christian action to take during this time.
Gayle, let's turn to animals, because we've talked about them briefly. A lot of people are asking about, our relationship to animals. How does the practice in farms, for instance, disrupt relationships of humans with domesticated animals? Or one of the questions that's come in is, how should this affect our eating practices?
So I need to say a few things in response to what Katharine said and also in response to your question. So I actually teach a course at Lutheran School of Theology here in Chicago called The Future of Creation, and it's about environmental issues. And we actually spend the entire time eating lower on the food chain in order to make for a better ecological environment, right? Because plants contribute to the environment. They're not as energy consumptive as animals are. And we also do a lot of other practices. We actually do we can try to conserve water during that time. And my hope is if we do this during the course, then maybe it'll become a habit afterwards. But one of the things that we found is most important, and so then there are farming practices that we work with, and we have a group in Chicago area called Faith in Place that actually works to get farm animals that are not using kind of the modern farming methods. So what's happening is we're doing things like taking all the beaks off of chickens. That's what is happening in our industrial farms. They're sometimes tying cows up by their tails to keep them in one place. They're making animals live in very small cages. And those sorts of things are extremely damaging to us because they get infections at a much higher rate, for one thing. So we're eating infected food. The animals are usually stressed, and that creates some biochemical changes in the meat that isn't so good. So what this Faith in Place does is they do three things that I think are really critical. Number one, they do promote safe farming practices, and they sell meats from animals that have been prepared properly. The second thing they do is they promote having everybody try their best to do conservative methods. But the third thing that I think relates to what Katharine said is they actually take a bus of people from Chicago, actually several buses of people, down to Springfield so that we can do an advocacy day down there about environment. And actually, it's had an impact. I mean, we stopped some of the fracking practices that occurred. We've stopped several other things within the state of Illinois. So I agree. The only way to get broad substantive change is through advocacy, through using our voices. And I will tell the sad fact that much as I've tried to pull Orthodox into the Faith in Place network, it has not been successful.
Yeah, that's very interesting that both of you talk about advocacy, because the emphasis often in Orthodox spirituality is on personal sort of practice. And I don't think that that's the general patristic sort of tradition, but that's what it's come down to. Nadia, what are some of examples, in your opinion, of good model scientific collaborations resulting from the COVID-19 pandemic that you think could be indispensable as we move forward?
I definitely think this effort to produce vaccines is something that is really admirable and commendable. I know a lot of people view this rapid vaccine development as a negative and a potential danger, but in fact, for the scientific community, it's a triumph. The fact that so many different agencies and organizations and companies were able to work together so quickly to produce a vaccine. And the reality is they built this vaccine on tens of years of scientific knowledge that has been developed by scientists. So this is not something that was just developed in the past year. It's built on a lot of knowledge related to coronaviruses and other types of viruses that's been happening in laboratories across the United States. So the collaboration between pharmaceutical companies, scientists, but also in some cases the funding from the federal government has really made this vaccine effort a huge triumph for science. And I hope that that's something that can continue moving forward, especially given the fact that we know there will be a number of emerging infections in our near future as well.
So we have several questions coming in. Metropolitan John spoke of the hubris also of science. What can any of you say about the weaknesses or the abuse of science, and not just of theology, but is there anything ethical or unethical in the way science functions, or the way the vaccines have been produced, or the way a vaccine might be held back to improve its capacity and so forth? What can you say about that? All three of you are, leading scientists. What are the problems in your own discipline?
Well, I'm happy to jump in and say that, I think about this issue a lot, because at least in my discipline, probably less than 50% of those, not the physicians, but of the scientists themselves are not people of faith. And maybe they're not anti-God, but they don't care about God. And they actually are a little bit prejudiced against people that express their religion in any way. I see that a lot. I think a large part of that is kind of a view of scientism rather than of science itself, which is this belief that everything can be in the world can be answered by science. That's a mistake. And that's where the vaccine comes in an important way, because it was science, not the scientism that only science could solve the problem. In fact, the fact is that we hoped that human nature would help us solve the problem by having people wear masks, which is actually a decision of human nature. It's not a decision just of science. So a cooperation is what's sort of needed here between science and humanity to achieve the results that are needed. And, you know, unfortunately, as your son Julian said, some people have chosen not to cooperate. And it's going to be the same thing as Nadia said with the vaccines. Not everybody can get a vaccine. Those of us that can need to do it to protect those who can't. It's got to be a cooperation. It's not just me science. It's going to be those that work to influence people to think about things that are going to make a difference here too.
I'd like to add, Father John, if you wouldn't mind, I'd like to add about sort of the imperfect nature of the scientific method. And I don't mean that in terms of the scientific method that produced vaccines, but the reality is we've had a number of medical and public health injustices in the past. And one of the questions in the Q&A was talking about this. You know, we experimented on Black Americans with the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, right? And that was really bad science, really bad medicine, really bad public health. And those injustices are carrying forward now in the Black community in terms of the large amount of vaccine hesitancy related to COVID in the Black community. So no, we have not been perfect at the scientific method in the past. And a lot of those who are suffering due to that are those who are most vulnerable or marginalized here in the United States and across the world. And we're going to have to deal with that now in the current context of COVID. We're going to have to work closely with communities and make sure that these communities that have been previously victims to our system really do understand the benefits and are able to make their own choices around vaccination now. So it has not been a perfect history, and we're going to have to really work hard to fix a lot of the issues that were created by past injustices.
Katharine, what would you add to that?
I'm glad you brought that up, because I was looking at Isabella's question too, and I wanted to make sure that that comes up. There's a fascinating book about a Black woman named Henrietta Lacks, and how her body and her cells and her tissue has been used for medical experiments. It's called The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, for years after her death. But science has also contributed to technology, and technology has also ended up disproportionately affecting those who do not have a voice. So the concept of environmental justice was coined by Bob Bullard, who is an environmental sociologist who lives in Houston, Texas. Back many decades ago, his wife, who was a lawyer, was explaining to him how she was fighting on behalf of a poor neighborhood in Texas, in Houston, who did not want more landfills put in their neighborhood. Because it turns out that all the landfills were being put there, and not only that, but Superfund sites with toxic chemicals are predominantly located in low-income neighborhoods where they don't have the impetus and the wealth and the influence to fight them. Then what happens when it rains? They flood, and all of the toxins from those dumps and those hazardous waste sites float out of the site and down often into people's homes. Not only that, but where do they site industry and coal-fired power plants where they can pollute the air that people breathe in poor neighborhoods? 200,000 people in the United States die on average every year from air pollution alone, and the majority of those people live in poor neighborhoods. And in fact, that is one of the reasons why, even though 30% of the people in Chicago are African American, over 60% of the COVID deaths were African American, because of the intersection between air pollution from our technology and our science. That's what created the internal combustion engine, and the interaction between diseased and damaged lungs and vulnerability to COVID. So science has led to technology that has created many benefits for us, but has created many drawbacks also, and the consequences fall disproportionately on the vulnerable, the poor, the marginalized, and those without a voice, both human and, of course, non-human, plant and animal life as well.
So with Bob Bullard, we can say there are good things that come out of Texas.
Absolutely.
Let me, Katharine, if you can sort of bring some of these threads together here, because there are a number of questions, mostly from clergy, about what the role of the church is here. What's the role of church leadership? What's the role of a parish priest, a pastor, in addressing on a local level, whether pandemic prevention or climate change?
Mhm. So the book that I mentioned to you, Scientists as Prophets, specifically speaks to how science can explain the present world to us. But prophecy is what we humans have used for centuries and even millennia to envision how the world could and should be in a manner that's consistent with what the author of that book calls our covenant values, which covenant is a word that we're very familiar with in our faith. So I believe that scientists are not prophets per se. We describe the way the world is, but how should the world be? How could the world be in a way that's consistent with our covenant values? That is where our religious leaders must step up to the plate. I believe it is their job to do that. Prophecy is not foretelling the future. Prophecy is talking about how the future could be, depending on the choices we make and how we want it to be, so that we can really truly express who we are and what we believe to be true.
Nadia and Gayle, from your experience as Orthodox Christians in parishes, how would you answer that question? What's the role of a pastor, of a faith leader?
Maybe Nadia should go, since she's more related to it than I am.
That's right. Yes.
I can certainly talk about it in a broad sense. I mean, you know, I don't believe a priest can do everything alone. And what I favor a lot of times is trying to have sort of pastoral teams where the priest has key people he can work with to help solve problems or to help work through issues. And so having a team that deals with how the parish is going to think through environment, how the parish is going to think through COVID. I mean, when we had to first deal with COVID, actually my priest made me come meet with a small team of us, and we figured out what the church was going to do. I think that kind of, team thinking, bringing in the experts that can actually help solve issues, is probably the best thing, because a priest can't know everything and shouldn't know everything. And consulting with others. I mean, the parishes, I mean, the laity, the laos, we are all the people of God together. We have to see this as a team effort.
I think that's so important. And I mean, if you're all speaking about advocacy and dialogue and connection, I remember when the Patriarchate first initiated these symposia on religion and science and the environment, and the claim and the pride really was that these were international, interfaith, and interdisciplinary. And the Patriarch would say that if I can get, because all of these symposia were held on ships, they were waterborne, seaborne symposia, right up until the last one. So the Patriarch would say, if I can get scientists and theologians and policymakers and journalists in one and the same boat, where they can't get off the boat, but they can only talk, maybe we'll get somewhere. So the whole notion of working with other people, which is difficult work, it's uncomfortable work, but I think that's I think how we do resolve problems. It is really what the church is about. Nadia, do you have any reflections on that?
I think this idea of communion and using sort of the expertise of the community is very important. I also think it needs to be led by strong leadership. And I think in the United States, we've seen sort of the failure of leadership to make action against the COVID pandemic. And I think leadership is very important with this regard, whether that's leadership at the community, at the parish level, or leadership at a larger level. That leadership relies on the community to support it, to inform it, as Gayle was mentioning. So I think communion here is really an important concept with regard to this question.
Thank you. And I think that's, in my opinion at least, why the Paris Accord is so important, not because it's the ultimate solution. In fact, it isn't. There's a lot more that needs to be done, but it is nations at least in dialogue. And that was the sin of pulling out of the Paris Agreement. I wonder, Katharine, if you can mention a little bit, because I know that you mentioned today you were doing lots of interviews on the decisions and the executive actions of the administration. Tell us what happened today.
So today was really a climate day, so to speak, in the White House, as President Biden signed a number of executive orders that address climate change across the board. There were orders stopping oil and gas, new oil and gas exploration and extraction on public lands as much as possible. He also put a moratorium on the Keystone XL pipeline. But in addition to that, there was a focus on integrating climate change preparedness, awareness, and mitigation across the federal government, the way it has to be. I myself, over the last few years, I've worked with the Department of Defense, the Department of Transportation. I've worked with the oceans and the atmosphere with NOAA, the Department of Commerce, and of course the EPA, and Department of Interior too. Climate change is an everything issue, and you can't just put it in the corner and say, oh, it's something that only the EPA can take care of. It is an everything issue. And so I know it might be not quite the headlines that you see talking about that part of his announcements. That is really important because that's the type of whole government approach that's needed to really effectively combat this. And also what I truly appreciated was the moral core to everything that they are doing and talking about. They are doing it as a matter of justice. Justice because it is not right to live today at the expense of future generations, at the expense of the poor and the vulnerable today, right here in the United States and North America, as well as on the other side of the world. It is not just to live at the expense of all living things that God created and put on this planet for us to care for. And so that perspective of beginning, again, not beginning with what we do, beginning with why we do it, I think is so important because we can often lose our way. And people have been commenting on how so often there's a lot of bony finger wagging and a lot of judging and a lot of you should be doing this and you're not doing that. But when we start with the core of what we believe and we know why we're doing it, I believe that's when true effective change can happen. And when the storms come against us, as they always do, we can weather those storms because we stand firm on a foundation.
Thank you. I'm glad you mentioned NOAA, by the way, because the head of that for some time was Jane Lubchenco. And Jane was the co-chair with Metropolitan John on the Religion, Science and Environment committee that the Patriarch set up, and a very staunch supporter of the work of His All Holiness. So there are a couple of questions here that I might want to just close with. Dr. Woloschak, your course seems to pull together a learning environment that is a combination of intellectual, emotional, relational, experiential strategies and experiences. Are the results compelling? Are they scalable to larger numbers?
The answer is yes. I mean, at Lutheran School, we have I normally have a small class, maybe I have 15 students. But I believe that model could be done at Orthodox seminaries. I've proposed it a number of times. I think it would fit in perfectly, and I would challenge any Orthodox seminary that wants to do it. I'd be happy to work with them to help develop it. I think it's would be a very important thing. I know in Europe, there is an Orthodox group of scholars that's working to try to integrate environmental issues into the curriculum of seminaries. And I think that's another way to do it. But we need, I think, to educate our clergy about these issues if we expect them to be prepared to deal with them.
I agree 100%. One last question here. Again, it's really for Orthodox Christians, but any of you can really answer. You spoke about advocacy. You spoke about, championing these issues on climate or anything else. Why is it that so many Orthodox oppose public protests? I've just learned actually of someone in the Orthodox Church that was seen at a protest, and she was punished by her local bishop.
Well, it
So,
doesn't know what the protest is, right?
yeah, okay. So
Okay, I
this
mean,
was
some examples.
this was more political, but I don't think it was wrong. About climate change, though. I mean, we know Archbishop Iacovos marched with Martin Luther King.
That's right.
And that made a huge difference. I've always said that if there's just one thing that Iacovos did in his life, and that was the photograph that he stood with King in Selma, then I think that's enough for him to enter the kingdom of heaven. But the truth is, almost in its entirety, the Greek Orthodox community in America opposed Iacovos standing by King. When Iacovos went to church the following day, they basically boycotted his service there. Nobody turned up to take him to the hotel or to greet him when he went to church. So why is it that there's this resistance, do you think, in Orthodox circles?
Let me say a couple of things. I mean, first of all, I do believe that Orthodox should and do stand up to advocate for those who are oppressed, for those who are that are hurting, for those that need help. And the environment is, in a way, caring for our planet, which, I mean, for Orthodox in a lot of ways, it's living, you know, in a very strange kind of way. And so I think that advocacy for the planet is something that Orthodox should actually support. Now, I'm not trying to say every kind of advocacy is correct. I mean, I'm not sure that marching in big protest marches does the same thing as saying, we're coming in, we want to advocate this, we're going to be in Congress this day, we're going to be standing outside, we're ready to talk to you, we're going to have some talks among our group on the steps. Give us permission to do it and we will do it. That's a kind of advocacy that actually educates, it brings people together, and we would be the ones to stand up for the underprivileged, for the hurt, as Archbishop Iacovos did. That said, I don't think I would say every single protest was an appropriate one, and that thing that happened in Washington a few weeks that some people are calling a protest that I think was much more like a riot, you know, that I can see condemning for people that participate in that. Right. So I think we need to be careful. I don't think we would support every single one, but there are ways that we do it. And there are Orthodox Marches for Life, for example, that many participate in, for what that's worth.
That's pretty much the only march that I know. Is that right?
It's the only one I know of, I think.
Let me ask you an interesting question that we got from one of the viewers. Could the three of you, as scientists, share either your favorite biblical passage or your favorite saint that inspires you? Let's start with, well, whoever's ready.
Oh, I could go first. I tell this all the time.
Go on, Gayle.
This is like a crazy story. So my favorite story is the biblical story about Nathanael. Nathanael is sitting under the tree and he is thinking something. And the Lord comes by and he says, and he starts talking to Nathanael, and Nathanael criticizes him, and he says, Nathanael, I saw you when you were sitting under the fig tree. And Nathanael springs forward and says, my Lord and my God. This is a miracle in a way. I don't know. No, we are not told what Nathanael was thinking. We are not told what he was thinking. But whatever he was thinking, he was speaking somehow to God, and he recognized it when Christ talked to him. That kind of subtleness of miracles. Those are the kinds of miracles that I see in my life.
So true. Thank you. Anyone else? Nadia?
Mine is, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me, which I know might be a little bit cliche, but I find a lot of strength in it. And I think it also can get us through really difficult times like the times we're facing right now.
Thank you. Catherine, what about you?
I put Nadia's verse on the first page of my dissertation because I felt like that was the case. But I would say that now, over the last 10 years, increasingly, my favorite verse has become one where the Apostle Paul is giving Timothy a very important piece of advice that I think we all need to take to heart today. When we see the public discourse that surrounds coronavirus, that surrounds climate change, that surrounds the future, I think there's really one word that characterizes people's response, and that word is fear. There's fear, with climate change, there's fear that if we act, it will destroy our comfortable lives. It will require too much sacrifice. It will be unpleasant. It would destroy the economy. But on the other hand, there's fear if we don't act, it will be an apocalypse. The world will end. Everybody will die. And so there's fear on both sides. And we see the same with COVID too. So here's the interesting thing. In this verse, in this letter, the Apostle Paul provides a litmus test to Timothy. He says, God is not the God of fear. He has not given you a spirit of fear. So if we are witnessing a spirit of fear, it's not from God. And he goes on, he says, God has given you three things. He's given you a spirit of power, which is kind of an old-fashioned word, but power means you are empowered, you can act. Fear often paralyzes us. Power means you can act. And then he says, I've given you a spirit of love, so you can care for and have compassion on other people, not just think of yourselves, which you do when you're afraid. And then as a scientist, my favorite one is the last line, and he's given you a sound mind to make good decisions based on the information that he's given you, which includes the brains that we have to understand the world that he has made. So I just feel like for me, when that fear begins to come against me, I stand firm and I can say it's not from God. And I can remind myself that even though I may not feel empowered, I may not feel love, sometimes I may not even feel like I have a sound mind, that those are gifts from God that he has given me. And with those gifts, I think we could all truly move forward into a better world.
Well, that's so beautiful. I want to thank you for, first of all, clarifying in such simple terminology the scientific issues, but also speaking such theological truths. I'm very grateful for that. One of the dimensions of the patriarchs and the patriarchate's ministry generally is dialogue with other confessions, other Christians and other faiths. And we've done this evening. The Patriarch has a very close relationship with Pope Francis. Metropolitan John chaired the dialogues with the Anglican Communion and with the Roman Catholic Church. These are all part of that hard work of connecting, of opening our minds, of being open to much more than our own interests and our own concerns. So this brings to a close our second webinar. And once again, I want to thank our very distinguished speakers. I want to thank all of you for your participation. And I want to thank my colleagues again, Nicholas Anton and Spiridula Fotinis, for their assistance. I hope you'll all join us tomorrow for a different conversation on another crucial aspect of COVID-19 and climate change, namely the implications and impacts on health. Thank you and good night.